a while back. Thanks very much. It's always great to have you, Minister, because it's very candid and it's very conversational. Let me just ask two fairly softball questions, and then Fred will pitch the hardball, then we'll open it up. But let me say in advance, the Minister will be available for a press conference after this session. So I would like the press people, whom there are many and many well-informed ones in the room, to hold their questions and let's have the kind of the trade experts ask theirs first. So my softball questions are these. I was told a day or so ago that in the Canada-EU agreement, the EU has informally said that it will give Canada any extra concessions that the U.S. gets out of the EU in the TTIP negotiations. That may or may not be correct. You can correct me if my information is wrong. But my question is this: has the U.S. said the same, that it will give Canada any extra concessions it gives Europe? That's question number one. And question number two is, this 2013, I have to say, amongst the trade experts in this room, of which there are many, no one believes that 2013 is possible to conclude TPP, and especially not if Japan joins as an active member in the negotiations during this year. So please.
Was that a question, the last
Yes,
one?
it was. Do you dispute all the trade experts in the room?
I thought it might simply be an editorial comment.
No,
but,
no.
Okay. Well, on the first one, you're going to find me to be somewhat obtuse. I'm not going to say what is being negotiated within the Canada-Europe Free Trade Agreement. I can tell you that given the nature and the level of integration of the Canadian and American economies, obviously on the Canadian side, we have very clearly turned our minds to what happens beyond our agreement with the EU. We have to look to what happens between the US and the EU. There's some that have speculated that once the US and EU have a deal, that could then morph into a transatlantic arrangement that would be by far the world's largest. And so very clearly we've focused on that as an issue, but exactly what is being negotiated, it would be inappropriate for me to comment. But I can tell you, just in very brief, we are making good headway to resolve the very small handful of remaining issues. These are obviously the most difficult issues, and what we try to do is come up with creative solutions to bridge those gaps going forward so that we can actually conclude. Mm-hmm. On the second issue on Japan, first of all, let me say that we have certainly welcomed Japan's interest in the TPP negotiations. Now, they haven't formally indicated that they're interested in joining, but there are rumors floating around. What I would say is many of you know that Canada is actually negotiating a bilateral agreement with Japan as we speak. We'll be moving into the second round of those negotiations in April. We see them not being mutually exclusive in that perfect sense. And Japan being the world's third largest economy, I believe that they represent a significant asset for whomever wishes to enter into a trade agreement with them. Certainly for Canada, we see them as a priority partner.
Oh, thanks. Fred?
Mr. Minister, thank you for coming to the Institute today. Thank you for your leadership on the trade issues. Let me ask you to think a little further with us on the evolution of the TPP process. And let's assume that what you hinted, what Gary hinted, it turns out to be correct. Japan comes in. I think if Japan comes in, it's almost automatic. Korea comes in. So now you've got a really big deal. A really big deal. What implications for China? You mentioned the hope that down the road TPP would broaden, bring in more countries. You did not mention China explicitly in your remarks, that it is the 800-pound gorilla in the global trading system now. What can you envisage as a further evolution of TPP with Japan and Korea coming in, hopefully and expectedly now, in terms of relations with China? Could this potentially tip the balance to a level of significance that induces the Chinese to want to come in? That would then presumably set us up for a free trade area of the Asia Pacific as a whole that you and other ministers have talked about. And what could that then do by way of resuming major forward progress in the whole global trading system? But talk a little bit about the impact on China, China's relationship to what's going on now, and how all that then might reinvigorate global trade liberalization.
Well, thank you for that question. Perhaps I'll preface my response by saying Canada and China do have a productive trade and investment relationship. It is not an easy one, but the lines of communication certainly remain open. As you probably know, we recently signed a bilateral investment treaty with China, which is not yet in force, but we expect it will be brought into force soon. But in the context of TPP, I don't think any of the partners have expressed a specific exclusion of China as perhaps being a partner someday. But let's focus on what the goals of the TPP are. Those goals are all focused on trade liberalization. The parties that are at the table have all committed to a high level of commitment to removing not only tariff barriers, but perhaps more importantly, the non-tariff barriers that really trouble many of us and that add so much cost to trade that goes on around the world, and in fact inhibit trade in a very significant way. And the partners that join the TPP have to make a very clear commitment to moving aggressively down that road. And until China shows that level of commitment, obviously it would be problematic for the current partners within TPP to consider them as members. So you used the term evolution of the TPP. It is an evolution. An evolution implies progress. And what is that progress focused on? It's on trade liberalization, which, by the way, is not only trade. We're talking about investment liberalization. And until partners meet sort of that basic standard, they would have to go back to the drawing boards to figure out how they're actually going to become one of those partners that shares the current 11 partners' views with respect to trade liberalization.
Claude, and then Claude.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. There's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years about the need to update NAFTA. If the TPP negotiations are successful, will that obviate the need to go back to the original trilateral agreement, or are there things that we would still, or the three countries together might still want to do separately?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one would first have to know what the TPP outcome looks like, and it's difficult to prejudge exactly what it will look like. Certainly, NAFTA is a first-generation agreement that is not as comprehensive as TPP will be. I expect that NAFTA will continue to be remain as a key bilateral agreement between Canada, the U.S., actually trilateral agreement amongst the three partner countries going forward. As you know, within the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, there are also bilateral elements that take place. For example, a number of Canada's key goals would be to have robust outcomes and chapters on government procurement and labor mobility / temporary entry. It is certainly possible that that could be done on a bilateral agreement. And again, the reason there are bilateral elements within trade negotiations that are regional in nature is because the unique circumstances that exist between two trading partners often make it impossible to expand the application of the goals of those two countries to all of the members within a regional negotiation. So I think we have an opportunity here to take care of things that we didn't even anticipate back 25 years ago when we first negotiated the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and to move our two countries forward in the removal of tariff and non-tariff barriers.
This gentleman, but first I just want to pick up on what you said on government procurement. I know that Buy America is a great source of distress to Canada, and I've heard that Canada would at least like to get the U.S. government to recognize that when federal money goes to the states, that federal money is open to procurement in Canada. Now, if that's a correct statement, are you getting any sympathy from Congress on, and the administration on at least having that level of open procurement?
Well, I'm going to be having meetings with members of Commerce actually today, quite a number of them, and certainly it's one of the issues I will raise. But I can tell you that I've met with numerous stakeholders here in the United States and talked about government procurement, and I've been actually surprised at the level of understanding and acknowledgement that restrictions on government procurement and limitations such as Buy America policies are actually, as between Canada and the US, given our integrated economies, is counterproductive. It's hurtful to both of our economies, because if our supply chains are so highly integrated, when you apply Buy America in the United States, it's essentially compulsory localization. What happens is that you're also impacting your own manufacturers, your own suppliers. And so we believe that the Canada-US relationship is unique to the point where on government procurement we really should be looking at expanding our current arrangements under the Canada-US procurement agreement.
This gentleman here, and then Wolfgang.
Thank you, Minister Fast. Eric Altor, I'm an international trade lawyer here in Washington. I've been representing the retail industry for many years, and I'm a fellow British Columbian too.
Vancouver?
Vancouver, yes. I wanted to, actually I got a couple of questions, one on the TPP and your thoughts on one of the big challenges in negotiating that agreement. We already have free trade agreements with quite a number of the current TPP partner countries. The one country that industry, U.S. business is particularly interested in is Vietnam. And as the Vietnamese trade minister said, of the 29 chapters in this agreement, we're interested in one, and that's market access for apparel and footwear. And there's a big concern, not only among the retailers, who obviously that's a core issue for them in this agreement, but also other industries who want to get a lot in the other chapters that are being negotiated and are concerned that the U.S. current unwillingness to present a meaningful proposal on market access for Vietnam is really jeopardizing the ability to get the best overall agreement for everybody. And I just wanted your thoughts on that. And with respect to Europe, just following on Fred's question, the interesting thing about the U.S.-EU negotiation as a means to develop a transatlantic partnership and the TPP is that in the case of the EU, we're negotiating with the other dominant economy in the Atlantic area and using that possibly to expand to create a Atlantic-wide agreement. With respect to the TPP, there's some who view this as a way to exclude or wall off China, which is the other dominant economy in the region now. I think that's an exercise in futility, but I guess it sort of builds on Fred's question about, these two dynamics and how they play out. I'd just like your thoughts on those. Thanks.
Well, let me answer the last question first. I have not heard any of the current 11 TPP partners articulate that the purpose of the TPP is to ring fence China. There's been lots of speculation. Of course, I've heard those thoughts expressed by those outside of the negotiations, or outside of the TPP negotiations, but I certainly haven't heard the actual partners themselves express that. We see this as a dynamic vehicle through which to expand trade opportunities within the Asia-Pacific region. So I think I'll restrict my comments to that. On the first question, which is the textiles and Vietnam's very focused interest in that chapter, I know there's a disagreement over the yarn forward versus the cut and sew, and who knows, maybe there's some intermediate ground that can be settled upon. Given the fact that those negotiations are ongoing, I know they've been very vigorous on that issue. I'm not sure I'd want to comment on the motives of any of the parties to those negotiations as to that issue. Clearly, the U.S. has certain interests and would have certain sensitivities. Clearly, Vietnam, has expressed this as being its #1 offensive interest in terms of an outcome in TPP. But like any other negotiations, typically at the end of the day, each party puts some water into their wine, comes up with a resolution, finds a way of bridging those gaps. I'd hate to think that would be the issue that prevents us from arriving at consensus in TPP. I mean, look at what's happened with the Doha round of the WTO. I would guess that most of you are profoundly disappointed, as we as Canadians are, that the preeminent form within which multilateral rules-based trading takes place would be basically in gridlock. Because the very credibility of the WTO rests with its ability to continue to move forward with trade liberalization. So when you see the moribund Doha round just sitting there, surely we see regional negotiations, plurilateral negotiations, and bilateral trade agreements as being perhaps perhaps not optimal, but certainly a second best way of perhaps reinvigorating the WTO, whether it's within the Doha round or elsewhere. So I'd want to be careful about assuming the outcome will be a negative one on that issue, because both parties are the U.S. and Vietnam obviously are defending their space, but at the same time, like in any other negotiation, there are all kinds of explorations going on to find middle ground that could satisfy both parties.
Wolfgang?
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Wolfgang Purzig with DHL. Good seeing you again. Mr. Minister, the Peterson Institute a few years ago put out a study which provided empirical evidence that raising the de minimis value, meaning the level at which customs duties kick in regarding cross-border traffic, would be a win-win, macroeconomically positive for everybody involved. Our industry, that is to say DHL, UPS, FedEx, and TNT together, we have pushed this concept, both domestically in the US. Just a few days ago, a Senate piece of legislation was introduced, but also internationally, particularly within APEC and in Vladivostok. We talked about this a little bit. Has there been some new thinking in Canada regarding the de minimis? We're acutely aware you look at this differently than some other APEC countries. Any progress over the last 2 years since APEC introduced the Pathfinder in Honolulu? Thank you.
Thank you. As you know, that is an issue that is being discussed and negotiated within the TPP context. and I'm not going to tell you expressly what progress has been made. What I can tell you is Canada agreed right from the start that we would discuss all issues at the table, including the de minimis provisions. And Canada's situation is, of course, complicated by the fact that we have a national value-added tax, and that concerns us. So certainly we have considered creative ways of addressing that. Is there sympathy for sort of a common rule on de minimis values? Yeah, I think we would say we recognize the value that could bring in terms of, again, trade facilitation, removal of barriers to trade at the border. So I think I'll restrict my comments to that, just to say that we've certainly come to the table with an open mind. Not an empty mind, but an open mind. Thank you.
Ambassador Nelson?
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for coming with us this morning. If I might have two simple questions. The first one is following up on your point about the potential impact on WTO of these big regional agreements that are being done in North America with TPP, North America with Europe. Are you detecting any hint from Brazil, from India, from the other countries the major countries that have been somewhat of a challenge in the global rounds? Are you detecting any hint of movement in those countries that we're looking at some of these global agreements and sort of seeing where things are going and a need to find a path forward for engagement of their own? And the second question is a hypothetical question. If USTR were to go to you and say, what is your advice? What do you think will be the two biggest issues that we will face negotiating with the EU? What would you tell them?
On the second question, I'm not going to comment because that's a negotiation between the United States and the EU. We're certainly not going to lecture the United States on what they should be doing to serve Canada's interest. And I don't think it would be appropriate for me to highlight what the challenges might be in a US-EU negotiation, because we haven't even completed our own negotiations. We're very close, but we're not there yet. But on the first question, I think that's a very good one. India, Brazil, the BRICS countries generally, obviously, you know, their interests are being juxtaposed against the interests of the developed world, and there are stresses, there are tensions there that have so far prevented us from bridging the gaps at the WTO level. But curiously, despite the fact that there is sometimes a lamenting from some of those BRICS countries that we shouldn't be engaging in these aggressive bilateral and regional negotiations. In fact, India is doing that very thing with the EU, with Canada. So they recognize they cannot be left behind. They have to find new ways of facilitating trade between them and some of their key trading partners. You look at China. China has not been aggressive necessarily in finding suitors for an FTA, but some of you may know that they have expressed an interest in a free trade agreement with Canada. So China understands that in the absence of an agreement within the Doha round, that there are other options available, including regional and also bilateral negotiations. Even, you know, Mercosur, Brazil being, of course, the biggest player there, they have been negotiating with the EU for 10 years, and it doesn't look like they're making a whole lot of progress. I mean, Canada also has an interest in that region of the world. The challenge, of course, is you're dealing with Mercosur, not just Brazil alone. And that presents some very significant, not only trade challenges and investment challenges, but geopolitical challenges. So I think as time goes by, reality sets in and people say, listen, Doha doesn't represent a way forward over the short to perhaps the medium term. So where do we go from there? We're now going to have to look at other strategic options that we explore. Certainly Canada has made that decision a long time ago that we wanted to have an aggressive trade agenda, which we are pursuing.
I'm going to give the last question to Ernie Puig. We're going to end then because the minister wants to carve out some time to talk to the press before his very busy schedule. So Ernie, you get the last one.
Ernie Krieg, Manufacturers Alliance. I have a brief historical autobiographical footnote which leads to my question. I'm old enough, my first experience in trade negotiations dates from your comment from President Kennedy. Summer of 1963, I entered the Trade Agreements Division at State, immediately spent several months in negotiating the U.S.-Canadian automotive sector free
Yes.
trade agreement.
Auto Pact.
The Auto Pact, which was the cornerstone for later going on. They were very successful, forward-looking negotiations. My first experience across the table was with Canadians. Leads to the question that's come up a couple times, but whether the U.S.-EU negotiation for a comprehensive free trade agreement might be even more the 21st century gold standard for what a FTA should be, and shouldn't it be transatlantic partnership, and shouldn't Canada, Mexico, and some Europeans be in? So my question is, do you see it in your interest, from Canadian point of view, to participate as these negotiations get underway, and have there been any conversations between our two governments about possible Canadian participation?
Yeah, to answer the second question first, obviously we have ongoing discussions with our counterparts in your government on trade issues. I don't think it's any surprise that Canada would be looking with great interest at an EU-US trade negotiation because of the nature of our integrated economies. That said, within current agreements, as we do with all of our trade partners, there are accumulation provisions that can be used. With respect to the United States, we've taken extra care to ensure that some of the opportunities we have to enhance even further our integration between our two countries could take place if in fact an EU-US agreement is actually finalized. I did mention aspirationally that there are some people that are actually looking even beyond that and saying, listen, what would this look like if it were a true transatlantic partnership agreement? I mean, it's premature to discuss that at this point in time because we each have our own bilateral negotiations ongoing, but it's certainly something that's going to be front and center a few years down the road. On the other point that you noted, which is could the EU-US agreement be even more 21st century? It's hard to tell. In some respects, it may be. My sense is that on issues like government procurement, it may not be, because we've taken very significant efforts within our EU negotiations, Canada-EU, to really make government procurement one of the centerpieces of our agreement. It is a very ambitious and robust outcome that we expect. Can it be translated into the EU-US context as easily? I don't know. I don't know. And of course that would drive one aspect of whether it is the most 21st century type of agreement in force. So I look forward with great anticipation to see how your negotiations move forward. And I can tell you, Canada welcomes those negotiations. We see that as a very significant step forward, even for Canada's interests. The more we can eliminate trade and barriers on both the tariff and non-tariff side between any two trading partners, the better it is for the global economy. That's certainly my sense, not being an economist.
Minister, thank you very much for spending an hour with us in conversation. There are a lot of questions left, so you have an open invitation to come back and take some more, but we very much appreciate your candor this morning.
Thank you very much.